مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الضغوط القصوى وهو المصطلح المستخدم لوصف السياسة خلال كوريا الشمالية، يشير الآن إلى السياسة الأميركية خلال إيران. بعد 3 أعوام من اتفاق إيران النووي، إعادة إدارة ترامب فرض كل العقوبات الاقتصادية على إيران. هل سيؤدي ذلك إلى مفاوضات نووية جديدة مع إيران؟ هل ستجبر هذه السياسة إيران على وقف تصرفاتها السلبية؟ أم إن هذه السياسة ستتطلق شرارة المزيد من العمليات الإرهابية وإحداث العنف في إنحاء الشرق الأوسط وحول العالم؟ لمناقشة عقوبات إيران ومستقبل السياسة الأميركية، يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية جون هانا وإيلاي ليك. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Iran, the country that has been the nemesis of America going back decades. Gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome Eli Lake, John Hanna, to help explain American policy and where they think this competition with Iran is going. So, gentlemen, the Trump administration reimposed sanctions, but the president had withdrawn from the Iran nuclear agreement months ago. Why the reimposition of sanctions now? What's going on? John?
Well, the president actually reimposed these sanctions in 2 different phases, one back in August and now one in November. And the reasoning is that they wanted to give companies in the international system who had gone back into Iran and began trading with Iran again because of the nuclear deal, they had to give those companies time to begin to unwind their businesses in Iran and to begin to pull out of Iran and stop their trade with Iran, particularly this trade in oil, which is Iran's most important commodity and its main source for foreign currency.
The main focus of the recent decision is oil. Is that right, Eli?
There's oil, but I think an even more important element of this is the delisting of Iranian banks from SWIFT.
So explain what that is.
Okay, so SWIFT is a consortium of banks that basically makes electronic banking possible and the transfer of wealth electronically possible. And it operates like you could argue a sort of international trade organization almost, but it has enormous implications for the ability of other entities and countries to pay Iran for the oil that they export. So there's 2 elements going on here. One is that all countries are basically asked to get to 0 in terms of purchases of Iranian oil, though there are some exemptions. And then what I think will happen with most of these countries, I'm pretty sure, is that any oil that is still purchased from the Iranians the revenue will be in an account that the Iranians will not be able to access, except for some exemptions on humanitarian, largely food and medicine. It's a bit complicated, but the delisting, if you will, of these banks from SWIFT, this international consortium, makes it almost impossible for the Iranians to get paid, even if people wanted to bust those sanctions.
So, John, the objective is to bring Iranian oil exports down to 0. Is that an achievable goal, in your view?
It's probably not. I think they can make very substantial cuts in Iranian oil exports, and it's said that Iran has already lost almost $1 million per day in exports of oil. It's now exporting still about 1 to 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. It can go down much further, but as Eli says, even if a country like China continues to purchase some quantities of Iranian oil, Iran is going to have very difficult time actually getting its hands on any of the money that it will earn from those sales, because they will be locked up in these foreign accounts with no way, because they've been knocked off this electronic messaging system, to actually repatriate the money back into Iranian hands to use to purchase or fund malign activities around the world. So the Iranians are really getting crunched, both with drops in their exports, but also an inability to access any of the cash from the remaining exports that they have.
All right, so let's take a step back, gentlemen. What's the idea here? What's the goal? Is the goal to starve the Iranians of cash in order to push them back to the negotiating table? Is it to starve them of cash so they can't do bad things around the world? Is it to bring down the regime? I mean, what is the goal here? John, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's, you're right, it's not quite clear. I think the president has certainly signaled that he's prepared for another negotiation, that he would like to get into a negotiations with the Iranians to negotiate a better deal than the Obama administration had. One that doesn't only include the Iranian nuclear program, but also includes Iran's other malign activities around the world, as well as its ballistic missile program. So that's what the president kind of has suggested the objective is. However, if you look at Secretary of State Pompeo and Ambassador John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, they've actually listed a set of 12 conditions that they want Iran to meet. That includes some very, very difficult things. Essentially, Iran getting out of terrorism, Iran stopping its interference in neighboring countries, ending its ballistic missile program. Things that if the Islamic Republic of Iran was to do these things, it would no longer be the Islamic Republic. And therefore, some people have thought there is a regime change underlying theme to what the administration might be up to.
So, Eli, you follow this very closely from inside government. You talk to a lot of people. What do you sense is the real objective here?
I don't think that the real objective is regime change. One reason for that is because if you were interested in regime change, you would find ways to make it easier for Iranians living outside of Iran who hate the regime to get money into Iran to support things like strike funds or other civil organizations that would ultimately be the best path, I think, for changing that regime. Also, the president has said explicitly that he wants to get a better deal, and he thinks that this is a part of a broader negotiation strategy. And I think that the list of the 12 demands, which are very good and often expressed as we want Iran to be a normal country, which is, I think everyone would want, except for the mullahs in Iran, that is consistent with a strategy to ultimately try to renegotiate. But it is a fantasy, in my view, to think that this kind of economic pressure will lead to regime change or a collapse in the government. That was an idea that was tried after the Gulf War in Iraq. It didn't work. It's an idea that really doesn't work. We don't have a lot of examples historically of this kind of thing working. What does work is when there is enough space for the people of a country to organize on their own and to ultimately withdraw their consent from the dictator. And we've already seen that in Iran following the Iran deal. We've seen it before that, and there is a lot that is going on underneath the surface in Iran. But I don't think that this particular sanction strategy gets us anywhere on that point.
So where does it get us then? So are you a supporter, or are you an advocate of the entire sanctions approach?
Well, my view when this was debated was that we should pursue a strategy of solidarity with the Iranian, movement for democracy, which I think is a very real thing. But now that we're there, I understand the logic of it. To deprive money from Iran's terrorist and war machine is good for the region. And so in that respect, it does solve this regional problem in some ways with Iran. It makes it much harder for them. They have to make much more difficult choices. But I don't think that that is eventually going to get us to the moment where the regime breaks because they keep choosing guns instead of butter, or they keep choosing foreign policy instead of domestic concerns. Even though I know that there's some people who think that that could work.
John, do you think that economic pressure is going to compel the regime to change course?
Again, I do think it forces the regime to make some much more difficult choices, particularly about something like continuing to support and prop up the Assad regime in Syria, which allegedly has cost them billions and billions of dollars. It'll be much harder for them to do that. I would just say that these economic sanctions that are now in place against Iran are really dramatically different from sanctions that the U.S. has done in the past, particularly with regard to Iraq and Saddam Hussein. This is much more like the draconian sanctions, the financial sanctions that were put in place on Iran in 2012. And within a year, when President Rouhani came in 2013, he was rushing back into a negotiation with John Kerry to relieve which was a genuine foreign currency crisis inside of Iran that they were facing, to be able to pay for any of the goods they needed inside of Iran. So I think there's a real likelihood, particularly since the Iranian economy today, I think, is in a much worse economic situation than it was in 2012, that these sanctions, if applied and enforced very rigorously, could certainly, make Iran forced to draw back from some of its worst malign activities in the region, but then also to come back to the table and actually begin negotiating some kind of new agreement with the Trump administration.
So there's a bit of a historical debate that is playing itself out again in the current moment. There are those who argue that it wasn't the sanctions that led to the Iran nuclear deal, that it was the opportunity to cut a good deal with the Obama administration. There are those on the other side who say, no, sanctions worked then to pressure them, and they'll work again now. You're in the view that sanctions worked and they'll work again.
I think that's right. I think there was another important debate when Trump withdrew from the deal and said he was going to reimpose sanctions, which was that people said, you're never going to achieve the same kinds of pressures we achieved in 2012 because Europe's opposed, Russia's opposed, China's opposed. I think, at least from the evidence we have now and the hundreds of European companies that have fled Iran because of their concern about U.S. sanctions, despite the fact that their governments want to stay in this deal and oppose the sanctions, I think it demonstrates that unilaterally, the awesome power of the U.S. financial system to be wielded as a very blunt instrument, even against our allies, to force them, whether they like it or not, to come along with this U.S. sanctions regime.
Eli, yes, is this effective and wise to be so tough on our allies?
Well, I want to get to something that you said, because I think you're correct that the power of secondary sanctions for the U.S. economy is so strong that it can drive huge corporations and banks to curtail their business with Iran. That's true. Where I do think that there is an argument for international cooperation is that that's distinct from Turkey or China purchasing oil and figuring out ways to get around the sanctions that are usually national decisions.
And to your point, Rob, in the short term, I think these unilateral U.S. action has been very effective and very powerful, far more than a lot of skeptics believed was possible. I do believe in the medium to long term, when the U.S. does wield this kind of power so aggressively, even against its allies, it does raise some longer term questions about what kind of counter-reaction will people eventually begin to mobilize. Will there be an alternative currency established so people don't have to deal with the U.S. dollar anymore? Will people establish a separate electronic messaging system, perhaps the Chinese and the Russians together with some Europeans, so they don't have to use the SWIFT system where the U.S. still has enormous influence? I think some of those questions, more problematic questions for what might be the backlash of this U.S. exercise of sanctions, really are worth serious thought by people in the U.S. government.
But so far, from your reporting, Eli, have you seen Europeans or other traditional allies of the United States lash out, and try to find other arena to compete with the United States because of the unilateral action by the Trump administration?
Well, there's a person in Brussels by the name of Federica Mogherini, and she is a foreign policy chief for the European Union, and sometimes she acts like she's the foreign minister of all of Europe. But so she has suggested that there will be a special financial mechanism that will allow for European businesses to bypass these sanctions. But when you talk to other actual governments with real foreign ministries, as opposed to sort of imaginary ones like the EU, you find that that's really a kind of concept that hasn't gotten very far. So I think there's two things that are going on here. The European Union and certainly countries like Germany and France are trying to tell the Iranians, don't flagrantly violate the nuclear deal and cause another process. They want to keep the Iranians in the deal on the nuclear side. And then they turn around and they say to the United States, we need the following things from you. But in order to persuade the Iranians that they are serious, they say publicly, well, we will have these things that will make it possible that we can stay in the deal and somewhat blunt the effects of these sanctions. So I think some of it is just sort of signaling the Europeans being in the middle between Iran and the United States. But is there a real threat at this point? I don't think so.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to focus on the other party to this dispute and what the Iranians are going to do now that tough American sanctions are back on the Islamic Republic. In just a moment. Again, my panelists today include John Hanna. John is a senior counselor at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a prominent Washington think tank. He has been in and out of government for more than 25 years. Sitting to his right is Eli Lake, a Bloomberg View columnist who writes about politics and foreign affairs. Okay, just one last question, gentlemen. If you're Tehran, would you try to just wait out the Trump administration, especially in light of our recent midterm elections? Is that a reasonable strategy for the Ayatollahs?
I think it is their strategy. I think that is what they are doing. And it's hard to say what a reasonable strategy is because I don't think anyone can predict what will happen in 2020 in the election. But there's also a chance, given all of the terrible things that the Iran has done in the Middle East regionally and the danger its nuclear program poses, that even if there was a Democratic administration, it's not entirely clear that it would go back to the Obama status quo. So, and we even saw, if Hillary Clinton had won the election in 2016, I'm not entirely sure that it would be so wonderful for the Iranians either. I think that the U.S. would have stayed in the nuclear deal, but I think there would have been increasing pressure on Iran's malign activities in the region.
John?
I do think if you polled most Iran analysts in Washington right now, they would agree with Eli that the strategy is, especially with the new Democratic House of Representatives, a split in the Congress, more pressure on the president perhaps, that their strategy will be to wait it out, to try and circumvent sanctions in any way that they can, but wait for Trump to be impeached, wait for Trump to be voted out of office in 2020, to have the Democrats come and save the Iranian nuclear deal and re-engage with Iran economically. I would just say, having worked in government for many years, that people like Qasem Soleimani, like the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Quds Force are very, very hard men. To imagine that they will simply sit by and allow the United States to try and collapse their economy, to push back against them in various venues in the Middle East without doing anything, simply waiting because Hassan Rouhani or the foreign minister Zarif wants to wait and thinks that I wouldn't put a lot of money on that option, and I would prepare for the worst, that the Iranians will respond in a time of place of their own choosing in ways that will be hard for us to respond to unless we're already ready, we have a plan, we're coordinated with our allies, and we have the necessary resources and capabilities deployed to go after the Iranians and retaliate when they take action against us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today and helping to explain American policy on Iran to our Dakhel, Washington viewers.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's clear that we have to realize that we're going to have partisan differences between Republicans and Democrats, but there's so much that we can work together on. Let's focus on those things that we know we can move forward. I believe the voting public expects us to work together where we can.
I think the American people are tired of partisan bickering, and they want to see us get work done. Part of the problem is that we don't develop relationships. We don't get to know each other the way that we used to. When you know someone, it's really hard to demonize, and it's much easier to listen and respect each other and have an exchange of ideas.
The murder of Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, evidently by Saudi government agents, perhaps acting on the authority of very senior officials, was horrific. It broke every rule in the diplomatic book, especially rules for decency, humanity, free speech, and human rights. It was a barbaric act that merits severe repercussions. Precisely what those penalties should be and how they relate to broader U.S.-Saudi relations is a topic for another day. Today I want to talk about one of the worst implications of the Khashoggi affair, the potential for false equivalence, the potential that it obscures the global and regional threats we and our allies in the region face together, the potential to wish, as Shakespeare might have said, a plague on all their houses, a policy which leaves everyone worse off, especially us. I knew Jamal Khashoggi, who was a fixture in Washington and a frequent guest at think tank events and public discussions on Middle East policy. His murder was gruesome and wholly unacceptable. While it may succeed in silencing critics of Saudi Arabia, it also has the implication of diverting attention from the great strategic menace that both Saudi Arabia and the United States share, the threatening behavior of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That would be a tragic error. Whatever we think about the Khashoggi affair, we should not let ourselves fall prey to the easy argument that they are all Middle East despotisms, our bastards versus their bastards. There is a very real difference. Only one of these regimes preaches death to America. Only one of these regimes routinely dispatches agents to commit terrorism around the globe. Only one of these regimes has been working feverishly for years to build its own nuclear weapon, illegally buying, stealing, or manufacturing the components to achieve its goal. Only one of these regimes has built underground networks of subversion and terrorism throughout the Middle East. Only one of these regimes is providing outlaws in Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a with the missiles and other weapons to wreak havoc on their citizens and to brazenly attack citizens in neighboring states. Only one of these regimes boasts about its Islamic empire that stretches from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Only one of these regimes considers America's allies, whether they are Arab countries or Israel, as enemies to the death. Only one of these regimes poses a clear and present danger to America and its interests. So let us do right by Jamal Khashoggi. Let us correct whatever imbalances in our foreign policy need correction. But let us not lose sight of the strategic realities that define the Middle East today. That would make the Khashoggi killing worse than a crime. It would become a grievous strategic mistake. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول مستقبل السياسة الأمريكية خلال إيران، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.